The morning sun cast golden hues over downtown Atlanta as Sarah Collins prepared for what she thought would be a routine court appearance. With a travel mug of coffee in one hand and her case documents in the other, she navigated through the slow-moving traffic, reviewing her notes on a minor parking ticket dispute. It was a small matter, one that should have been resolved in minutes, but fate had other plans. Sarah, a federal prosecutor, had faced high-stakes cases involving corruption and trafficking, but today she was simply a citizen contesting an unfair fine. She had parked in a spot where the signage was unclear and had photographic proof to back her case. She had no idea that stepping into that courtroom would expose deep-seated biases in the justice system. At 8:50 a.m., she received a call from her boss, an urgent request regarding the Thompson human trafficking case, one of the biggest in Georgia. She quickly found a parking spot, opened her laptop, and got to work, knowing her analysis could impact the case's outcome. After a quick review, she called her boss, provided her insights, and assured him she would follow up. By the time she pulled into the municipal court's parking lot, it was 9:10 a.m. It was the first time in her career that she was late for a court proceeding. She hurried inside, unaware that her tardy arrival would become the trigger for something much bigger than a parking ticket. Inside the cold, rigid courtroom, Judge William Barrett was already working through the morning's cases. Known for his strict demeanor and unforgiving nature, he prided himself on running his courtroom like clockwork. His reputation was built on harsh fines and scathing lectures, and he had little patience for those he deemed careless. As Sarah quietly entered the room, the air shifted. The judge immediately stopped speaking, his sharp gaze locking onto her. "Step forward," he commanded, his voice laced with irritation. The courtroom fell silent. Sarah, maintaining her composure, walked confidently to the podium. She noticed how the judge's disapproval was written all over his face. "You must be Sarah Collins. You were scheduled for 9 a.m., the judge emphasized, his tone dripping with authority. "Do you think your time is more valuable than the court's time?" Before she could respond, he continued, his voice rising so everyone could hear. "In this courtroom, we have rules. This isn't some neighborhood gathering where you can just show up whenever you please. This is a court of law." The air in the room grew heavier. Sarah clenched her jaw, but remained calm, professional, and composed. The bailiff, James Wilson, a man who had seen this judge's pattern of behavior too many times before, shifted uncomfortably. A young white businessman had arrived 5 minutes late earlier, and the judge barely acknowledged it. Yet here Sarah was being humiliated in front of everyone. She had faced prejudice before, but today something was different. She wasn't just here as a citizen, she was a federal prosecutor, and this courtroom was about to witness a reckoning. The courtroom sat in uneasy silence as Judge Barrett continued his public scolding. His voice carried an air of superiority, designed to make an example out of Sarah. "This court will not tolerate such disregard for procedures," he declared, his grip tightening on the gavel. "Perhaps a fine will remind you of the importance of punctuality." The words echoed through the courtroom, and Sarah noticed the shift in energy among the other defendants. People exchanged glances. Some looked uncomfortable. Others nodded as if they had seen this play out before. Then, the hammer fell. "Miss Collins, I am fining you $500 for contempt of court." A murmur rippled through the room. This was one of the highest fines he had issued for tardiness. Just last week, a white attorney had arrived 20 minutes late and received nothing but a mild warning. The court clerk, Mrs. Thompson, hesitated before typing the fine into the system. She had been working in this courtroom for over a decade and had seen patterns emerge, but today, something about it felt different. Sarah took a slow, steady breath. She had prosecuted major criminals, taken down corrupt officials, and debated some of the sharpest legal minds in the country. Yet, here she stood, in a municipal courtroom, being treated as if she were beneath the very system she had sworn to serve. The judge, however, had made a crucial mistake. He thought she would quietly accept his punishment. He thought she would be embarrassed. He thought she would shrink under his authority. He was wrong. Sarah calmly reached into her briefcase, her movements deliberate. The judge barely paid attention, expecting her to pay the fine and leave. But then, the room froze. She pulled out a leather credential holder, its gold federal seal catching the courtroom lights. She raised it for all to see. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady yet commanding, "before we proceed, I need to formally introduce myself for the record." She opened the credentials. I am Assistant United States Attorney Sarah Collins, serving in the Northern District of Georgia. The entire courtroom gasped. The judge's face turned pale. The bailiff, James Wilson, let out a slow breath, as if he had been waiting for this moment his entire career. Mrs. Thompson stopped typing mid-sentence, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The gallery, defendants, lawyers, and onlookers, watched in stunned silence. The weight of Sarah's title crushed the judge's arrogance in an instant. The judge's mouth opened and closed as if words had abandoned him. He had just humiliated a federal prosecutor. He had just fined a federal officer $500 without cause. He had just exposed his own bias in front of an entire courtroom. His hands, once steady, fumbled with the papers on his desk. "Had I known your position," he started, his voice suddenly uncertain. Sarah didn't let him finish. "My position should not matter, Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "What matters is the equal application of justice." Now, the courtroom wasn't just watching. They were witnessing something historic. Judge Barrett shifted in his seat, his once imposing figure suddenly looking much smaller in the grand wooden chair. The authority he had wielded so effortlessly moments ago now seemed like a fragile illusion. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, not just from the exchange between Sarah and the judge, but from the collective realization that had just washed over everyone in the room. Sarah wasn't just another defendant standing before him. She was a federal prosecutor. And more importantly, she knew exactly what she was doing. Sarah folded her hands in front of her, her expression professional but unwavering. "Your Honor, I respectfully decline the dismissal of my fine," she said. The room collectively inhaled. Was she really turning down a chance to walk away without consequences? Judge Barrett blinked. "Excuse me?" Sarah nodded. "Instead, I propose a larger discussion on how fines, contempt charges, and penalties are issued in this courtroom." She glanced down at her phone, where she had been taking notes. "This morning alone, I witnessed 7 people arrive late. 3 were white professionals who received no reprimand. 2 were Asian students who received a verbal warning. 2 were black individuals, myself included, who received the harshest punishment." She looked directly at Judge Barrett. "Would Your Honor like to explain that discrepancy?" The courtroom was now fully engaged. The young white woman in the business suit, who had arrived late just like Sarah, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The elderly black man in the gallery sat up straighter, nodding slowly, as if he had waited years for someone to say these words. Even the court clerk, Mrs. Thompson, hesitated before typing, as if suddenly aware of the historical weight of this moment. Judge Barrett's face was turning red, not with anger, but with the unmistakable flush of humiliation. He cleared his throat, fumbling for a response. "Ms. Collins, these are serious accusations." Sarah cut in, her voice as sharp as a scalpel. "I am not making accusations, Your Honor. I am stating facts." She then reached into her bag and pulled out a checkbook. With precise, deliberate movements, she wrote out a check for $500 and held it up for the entire courtroom to see. "I will pay this fine," she announced. "Not because it is fair, but because it will serve as evidence of today's proceedings." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. The judge stared at the check in her hand. He knew, in this moment, he had lost control of his courtroom. Sarah continued, her voice unwavering. "Furthermore, I am formally requesting a 6-month review of all contempt charges and fines issued in this courtroom, an analysis of who is penalized and why." Judge Barrett visibly paled. She wasn't just calling him out. She was demanding accountability, and now the entire courtroom was watching. Judge Barrett exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. For the first time, his authority was slipping through his fingers. Mrs. Thompson was still typing, but now with a different kind of determination. James Wilson, the bailiff, shifted slightly closer to the judge's bench, his stance protective, but his expression unreadable. And the gallery, every person sitting on those wooden benches, was hanging on to Sarah's every word. Judge Barrett finally found his voice. "Ms. Collins, Attorney Collins," she corrected. "And if the court will not take immediate action, I will escalate this matter to the Judicial Review Board." A collective gasp. The judge's face turned the color of parchment. That was the moment he knew. This wasn't just another case. This was the beginning of something much bigger. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Judge Barrett sat frozen in his chair, his lips slightly parted as if grasping for words that refused to come. For the first time in his 30 years on the bench, he wasn't in control, and everyone knew it. Sarah placed her check on the podium, not as an apology, but as a statement. "I trust the court will document this payment appropriately," she said, her voice calm yet razor sharp. Judge Barrett swallowed hard. The power had shifted, and he had no idea how to get it back. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, was still typing. But now it was different. She wasn't just documenting a court proceeding. She was recording history. The entire room sat in stunned silence. Then, from the back of the courtroom, a slow, deliberate clap. James Wilson, the bailiff, the man who had stood in this very courtroom for over 15 years, watching countless black defendants receive harsher penalties than their white counterparts, was clapping. A ripple of applause followed. One by one, defendants, spectators, even a few attorneys sitting in the gallery began to clap. Sarah didn't smile. This wasn't about applause. This was about justice. Judge Barrett's hands tightened into fists. His face was red, but not with anger, with fear of what was coming next. Because Sarah wasn't done yet. She took a step back from the podium, but didn't leave. She wasn't going to let this moment pass unnoticed. She turned to the court clerk. "Mrs. Thompson, I would like to request that the last 6 months of contempt, fines, and penalties issued by this courtroom be made available for independent review." The courtroom gasped again. Judge Barrett snapped his head up. "That is unnecessary!" Sarah didn't let him finish. "Unnecessary?" she echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Then surely you have no problem with transparency." Judge Barrett exhaled sharply. He was losing ground fast. But Sarah wasn't finished. She turned to the gallery, addressing everyone in the room. "Every single person in this courtroom today has seen what happens when power goes unchecked." Her voice didn't waver. "I will not allow today to be forgotten. I will be submitting a formal complaint to the Judicial Review Board regarding the patterns of racial bias observed in this courtroom." The entire room was still. Even the young woman in the business suit, who had arrived late just like Sarah but received no punishment, was watching, her face pale. Judge Barrett gritted his teeth. Sarah turned back to him. "Your Honor, I assume this court stands for fairness and equality, correct?" Judge Barrett blinked, realizing the trap. If he said yes, he'd be forced to comply with Sarah's request. If he said no, he'd be admitting the bias in his courtroom. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, "Mrs. Thompson," Judge Barrett said, his voice strangely quiet. The clerk hesitated. "Make the records available." A collective gasp. Sarah nodded, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Your Honor." Judge Barrett lowered his gaze. For the first time, he couldn't meet Sarah's eyes. She turned, lifted her check from the podium, and walked out. Not as a defendant, but as a force of change. What happened next shocked everyone. Within hours, the story had spread. First, through whispers among lawyers, then through social media, and by the next morning, it was on the news. Federal prosecutor challenges judge over racial bias in court. Reporters flooded the courthouse. Attorneys began reviewing old cases. And most importantly, former defendants began speaking out. The review board launched an investigation. And in just 3 months, Judge Barrett was no longer on the bench. But Sarah's fight didn't stop there. She had lit a fire. And now she was leading the charge. A national movement was born. This wasn't just about one case. It was about all the cases like it that had gone unnoticed. Sarah wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been unfairly treated in a courtroom. And now it's up to us. What do you think? Should all court cases be reviewed for bias? Comment below. Hit like if you think Sarah was right. Subscribe for more real stories that matter. Let's keep the conversation going, because change starts with us. One woman, one moment, one system challenged. And this is just the beginning.